For about 650 years, there has been a church here at the centre of this community of Ickenham. It is a lovely building, as you will soon discover. But a church is primarily people, not a building. In this 650th anniversary year, we tried to involve as many people on the local community as we can, in exhibitions, in drama, in music, and in special services. What is our aim as a church? In close cooperation with our friends at the United Reformed Church in Ickenham, to serve all God's people here and to extend his kingdom. I'm sure you're going to enjoy with me this conducted tour of St Giles. And now we will go and join Philip Robinson, who is waiting for us in the churchyard.
Thank you, Paul. In fact, I'm standing just across the road, looking at the church from this picturesque corner of the village. St Giles Church, which stands in the north part of the parish, was built largely in the early part of the 14th century. The parish register records the name of John Payne as the first rector in 1335. The walls are of flint, rubble and brick. Part of the church is covered in concrete, which was a cheap but not very effective way of keeping out the damp. The brand new path that you see was given by John Hillier and now ensures everyone a dry journey to the church hall whilst retaining the charm of the original gravel walk. In 1962, as extensive repairs were necessary on the outside east wall of the chancel, the opportunity was taken to strip the concrete covering and to reveal the ancient flintwork and wooden beams. The gilded weather vane on the spire was given to the church by Thomas Bryan Clark Thornhill, last lord of the manor of Ickenham. The golden cock had previously adorned the stables and coach houses at Swakeleys for many years. It was mounted during the restoration and replaced a rather inconspicuous arrow. Doubtless it was overlooked that an arrow is part of the insignia of St Giles. The spire has fairly recently been re-shingled. The porch was probably built around 1500. Recent excavations have shown that when its walls were built, they were laid on rafts of brushwood, so as to take the weight of the roof on the sliding clay. Timber was much used in the construction of porches at that time because there was considerable woodland in the area. The porch was thoroughly restored in 1962 when the old roof beams were exposed and antique glass put in place of the shutters, which were added to keep out the rain some 40 years ago. This oak door was made of timber grown on Swakeleys estate and consists of battens with strap hinges, probably dating from the 16th century. It has been moved from its original interior position to where you see it now. It was refurbished and rehung in 1984 at a cost of some £200. We now move into the porch. Moving down from the roof beams, we see an ancient stone coffin cover, which was revealed whilst the floor was being excavated. Superscribed with a curious cross, which the British Museum dates between 1350 and 1450, it seems that this may well be one of the earliest gravestones of the Shoreditch family. We have been informed that it is the only one of its kind that has been found in Middlesex. Next to this coffin cover, there are the remains of a medieval holy water stoup, which was probably smashed in the time of Cromwell. We now enter the church.
4 upright beams of oak with curved braces and moulded joints support the belfry and spire. As you can hear, there is a chime of 3 bells. The largest, a C-sharp tenor, weighs 500 weight and was cast in 1510 by Thomas Bullaston. The second was cast by Philip Whiteman in the 17th century, and the 3 1/4 hundredweight treble bell was cast at the Whitechapel Foundry in 1589. The Sanctus bell, which you heard earlier, dates from 1582. The bells are stationary and are chimed by independent hammers, as the tower is not large enough to allow them to be swung freely.
Owing to the war years, not much work was done on the fabric of the church. Therefore, when it came to Jimmy Gladdy ringing the bells, one day they didn't ring. And on inspection it was found that the wheels, which are made of elm, had fallen to pieces. And so 3 carpenters were sent up there in the following weeks to do the repair work. And when you're engrossed on a job, you get so taken up with the work that other things take second place. So that feeling hungry didn't come into the curriculum at all. And as we were working, one said, I'm feeling a little bit hungry. What's the time? And so the one with the watch said, we should have knocked off work a couple of hours ago, it's past 7 o'clock. You must understand that up there it was always dark. There was no daylight up there. And the sole means of illumination were candles. Each one had 2 or 3 according to what bit of work he was doing. And accordingly, we decided the best thing to do was blow out the candles and come down. So we did just that, blew out the candles and came down the Jacob's ladder, which stood in the corner of the lower belfry. And when we got to the door, we found we were well and truly locked in. And to be locked in the church is no picnic. The big door, which is now outside, was inside at that time. The alteration was made at the Restoration. And we decided we'd got to do something about it. We tried all the windows and they were all barred up. Either that or stained glass windows. Well, we couldn't bust any of those. So one of us hit on the bright idea of ringing the bells. And we decided, well, we couldn't do that because the wheels were busted and that's what we were doing, supposed to be repairing them. So we climbed back into the belfry and each took a hammer and each took a bell, and we rung those bells as they've never been rung before and will never be rung again. And I think some of the villagers thought the war had started all over again because front doors opened, windows opened, and Jim Gladdy, who had been home and washed and had his dinner for the last couple of hours, came scampering up the path using the most ungodly language you ever heard in a churchyard. And he wanted to know what it was all about before he unlocked the door. And then he unlocked the door and we, in our turn, used some ungodly language to old Jimmy and told him what we thought about him and where he would go when he had the last call. And we all got home a little bit late for dinner that night.
The nave was built in the latter half of the 14th century and is the earliest part of the present building. The beams, braces, rafters, and king post trusses were deliberately exposed by the removal of a whitewashed plaster ceiling above the nave and chancel. Layers of paint had to be stripped to reveal the beauty of the oak. These old rough-cut timbers are original except for one on the south side, which had to be replaced in 1962 by an ancient timber discovered in Essex after much searching.
This finely carved light oak pulpit was erected in 1926 in memory of the Shoreditch family and designed by Clifford Robert Davy, who is buried in the churchyard. It replaces a much heavier pulpit of pitch pine. In the Cromwell window, one can see fragments of 14th century glass taken from an earlier window, broken possibly by the Roundheads. An illuminated book recording the names of those who fell in World War II stands beside a Toc-H lamp. As evidence that the nave was used before the chancel was completed, there is cited beside the pulpit a 14th century piscina, which was used to cleanse the sacred vessels used at the altar. It is one of a pair, the second being in the chancel itself. This new extension to the nave, beginning at the belfry, was added in 1958. Old beams were procured and the original panelling transferred, so that it blends perfectly with the work of the craftsmen of some 600 or 700 years ago. The window above the panelling was subscribed by Sunday schools of the parish. At the same time, vestries for the choir and rector were added, together with a cloakroom. The Kershaw and Orchard memorial windows, which adorn the south wall of the nave, are both of modern design and manufacture. The orchard window is a particularly poignant reminder of the tragedy that befell the entire Orchard family. All died in an air crash while on their way to a holiday, just hours after worshipping at St Giles. The newly signed covenant of friendship and cooperation between the United Reformed Church and St Giles, which is beautifully handwritten on parchment, now hangs on the wall between these windows. Opposite these windows, on the north wall of the nave, hangs a fine painting by Joan Scott, a local artist. It was presented to the church by John Hillier at Easter 1983 and depicts the church and patron saint in the centre, with local scenes round the border. This bust of the 3rd Earl of Essex mysteriously found its way into the church from Swakely's house. Essex was appointed first Commander-in-Chief of the Roundhead Army in July 1642, at the outbreak of the Civil War. Moving into the north aisle, we come to the entrance to St John's Chapel, which was originally built as a mortuary, known as Swakely's Vault, by Sir James Harrington of Swakely's in the 17th century. It was restored in 1960 through a bequest of Mr. Poole and in memory of Mrs. Lockett, having been in a poor state of repair, and is now one of the gems of the church. Inside the chapel, we see the houseling benches which were once used in the main body of the church before the present altar rails were installed. The pews were cut down to size from the original pitch pine seats, so as to make room for about a dozen people. The old Jacobean altar table was moved to the chapel from the nave after being refurbished by a local carpenter and fitted with an oak reredos and 3 crosses. Recurrent dampness has necessitated further repairs, and the small holes visible in the walls are evidence of the latest plan to maintain the chapel. The niches in the wall were built to accommodate coffins, whilst others were placed under the floor of the chamber. These date between 1647 and 1892. In this pillar is still immured the body of Elizabeth Harrington, Sir James's second daughter, who died during her 3rd year. The body of another of his children also remains immured in the chapel. The church contains many sad reminders of the death of children, as well as happy and glorious tributes. In 1914, 30 bodies were removed from the chamber and reburied in the northwest corner of the churchyard. At the time, it was intended to turn the chamber into a vestry, but the work had to be postponed until after the First World War. Work finally began in 1921. This brass plate commemorates Sir Thomas Viner, whose body was brought back to Ickenham from Rome, where he died in 1707, and deposited in the mortuary. When work commenced converting the chamber into a vestry, this doorway was cut, giving access to the church. The chamber remained in use as a vestry until 1958.
Just outside the chapel and over the entrance we see a tablet commemorating John George Clark, barrister, who died in 1800 at the age of 24 from a ruptured artery. It is of interest as it is one of a pair sculpted by the well-known artist T. Banks. The other describes in fulsome terms the virtues of the Reverend Thomas Clark, who died in 1796. The north aisle of the church was added by William Say between 1575 and 1580. It is of brick construction. The roof is 16th century, but is unfortunately covered up by plasterboard. Hopefully it will one day be restored. In the east wall is a reset late 14th century window with its head cut off square above the lights. On the north wall there are further tablets commemorating other members of the Clark family. Below this memorial window, dedicated to Madeline Alexander Joy in 1926, there is an ancient painted 17th century wooden chest, recently presented to the church by Mrs. Alice Mallet. It was chemically treated in 1984 because of the evidence of woodworm, and is now used to store music for the choir. The window on the east wall is dedicated to the memory of A Company, 14th Battalion, Middlesex Home Guard. It was they who were responsible for the defence of the village during the years 1940 to 1944.
The Reverend Langton, when he first came here, all he found for illumination in the church were oil lamps, and they didn't give a very good light. People sung and said the prayers because they knew them off by heart. That was the number who came anyway. And he decided on a different set of lighting. And he tried out at the old rectory acetylene gas. Now that depends on water running onto carbide crystals, and a certain amount of pressure has to be added to it. Well, he tried it out at the rectory and it worked very well. It gave a lovely light, a white light. And then it was installed in the rectory at the restoration. And a gantry was put up outside with weights on it to supply the pressure. And the water was laid on, and the trickle of water went onto the carbide to make the gas. And everybody was pleased with it. until one very dark winter night. It was very dark and very cold. And nobody had thought of this beforehand, but they thought of it afterwards, that the water might freeze up. And that's just what it did. And it was, as I say, very, very cold, very, very dark. And when the Rector, Reverend Langton, began the prayer, "Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord," all the lights went out and we were in utter darkness. And then, groping about, the Rector beseeched one or two of the sidesmen to go into the shed and resurrect one or two of the oil lamps to see if there was enough oil in them to allow the people to find their way out of the church.
In 1962, following the extension of the nave, a small organ by Noel Mander was placed in a loft beneath the belfry. This replaced a somewhat larger instrument that used to stand in the north aisle and use some 18th century pipes from the old organ. However, there were problems of acoustics due to the organ's small size and also due to the position of the choir in the north aisle. These were solved in early 1983 by the installation of an Allen digital computer organ of 37 stops with separate sound channels for choir and nave. This organ has aroused a great deal of local interest and has been of great benefit to the maintenance of the musical tradition at St Giles. In this corner of the north aisle is the baptistry, which was restored to its original place in 1962. You see the exquisitely carved Jacobean wooden font, the cover of which is probably of a later date. It was returned to the church in the early 1920s after residing at Swakely's house, where comically it was used for some time as a tea caddy and possibly as a work table. It was restored by Mr. Burr, a former churchwarden, and rededicated in 1934. During the 1960s, the eagle developed a small hole in its head from which wood dust would pour, like pepper from a pepper pot, every time the lid was removed and turned over. The problem was only eradicated by a good dose of Rentakill, followed by the application of resin to fill the cavity, and then regilding. The wheels were installed on the base of the font at about the same time.
Nicholas Daniel, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Close by the font, on the east wall, is a fine brass of a male figure dated about 1545. It may well be one of the Say family, but both inscriptions and date are missing.
The chancel is only 16 feet by 12 feet and was built in the second half of the 14th century, after the nave was completed. The chancel arch is modern, being added in the 19th century. The beautiful late 14th century east window has 3 cinquefoil lights and vertical tracery in a 2-centred head. It was restored to the memory of William Capel Clark Thornhill, who died in 1898. The reredos, which was unveiled in 1926, has the symbols of the 4 Gospels, the emblem of St Giles, and the coat of arms of the Diocese of London. The twin flower stands, which are placed at each side of the altar, were given in memory of yet another tragedy, when 6 children died in a terrible fire. The roof of the chancel is of trussed rafter type, with 1 chamfered tie beam, and is probably late 14th century. On the north wall is a fine brass to the memory of Edmund Shoreditch, who died in 1584, and his wife and 3 children. This is the common pronunciation of the name, and has been since the turn of the century. However, current members of the family maintain that the original pronunciation was Shoredike. This family was connected with the parish as lords of the manor, patrons or rectors from 1370 until the advent of the Clark family at Swatelys at the end of the 18th century. The floor slab commemorates the death of John Glover, a former rector who died in 1714. The brass on the south wall commemorates William Say, the builder of the North Aisle, who died in 1582. There are effigies of himself, his wife, and 16 children, and it bears heraldic escutcheons. He was Register to Elizabeth I and Proctor of the Arches. This is a particularly fine brass and often copied for its Elizabethan costumes. This south-facing window is late 14th century and restored in memory of Helen Clark, who died in November 1895. The stained glass features St Petrus and St Paulus. It has 2 cinquefoil lights with a quatrefoil in a 2-centred head. On this windowsill rests the most outstanding and interesting monument in the church. It is a sculpture of Sir Robert Clayton's baby son, who died a few hours after birth in August 1665. It is made in veined marble, 2 feet in length, and shows the child in a chrism cloth, which by custom denoted innocence at baptism, and, owing to the child's early death, was used as a burial shroud. The figure was dug up from the churchyard in 1921 and placed in its present position in 1927. It is considered to be the finest example of a shrouded baby in the country.
The altar rails were given in 1948 in memory of the Shoreditch family and brought forward to their present position in 1962, when side sections were added to accommodate the greatly increased number of communicants. The carving was beautifully executed by a fine craftsman and perfectly matches the original rails. The new hassocks you see were made mainly by Marguerite Davis during 1984 in memory of her husband Gwilym, a greatly loved former churchwarden and verger, who died in 1983 and to whom a grateful parish erected a memorial plaque which can be seen on the south wall of the old nave. The beautiful double kneeler, which Mrs. Davis made at the age of 80 years, is now used for the bride and groom during wedding ceremonies.
We have now come to the end of our short guided tour of the church. I hope you have found it interesting. One of the special events that have taken place during our 650th anniversary year has been a historical exhibition. This brought together village primary and secondary schools and members of the community such as the Ickenham Residents Association and the Workers' Educational Association. Come with me as together we explore this exhibition and give thanks to God for 650 years of uninterrupted worship of God.